And I bet you're wondering why a PowerPoint. Yes, but I promise it's mostly photos. I am not going to kill you by PowerPoint at this point. Yes, here we are.
Okay, we have it up. You can start.
Well, go ahead and skip to the next slide, please. So thank you for the introduction, Elise. And who am I really giving this talk today? So my street cred is that I am 5 years sober and I am in recovery myself from eating disorders. That's the ED, and then SUD, the substance use disorders, namely alcohol use disorder. So I've been sober 5 years, but I have been a registered nurse for 22 years. And recently, in the last 5 years, I think since I got sober, I specialized in mental health as a nurse. So I got my board certification in psychiatric mental health nursing, as well as became a certified addiction RN. And as Elise said, I'm also a wife and a stepmom, and but the most important thing that I am is just a human being, sort of relaying my story to you, human to human. Because I am working in behavioral health now, I have the language to tell this story, I think, a little bit better. But at the end of the day, I am just a human being that is recovering and looking back on a long, long period of darkness. And so I really appreciate you joining me today. I promise to tell this story in photos, not so much in a bulleted way in a PowerPoint. I just thought the photos were really powerful. A lot of times when we hear people talk about their story and we see in front of us a polished version of that person, it's hard to imagine that they were ever, having this dark night of the soul, or it's hard to imagine the rock bottom, and it's really hard to imagine how they even got there and how they recovered. So I think these pictures tell about 1,000 words. So next slide, please. The big word here, and what this talk is mostly about, is drunkorexia. And what that is sort of a slang term, a colloquial term. It's been reserved for college campuses where we describe young, a lot of times female behavior in restricting calories so they can later binge drink, and or experiencing a restriction of calories and then binge eating, binge drinking and eating combined. And it's a kind of a mishmash of these two sort of insidious disorders as they come together. As an adult, I think we see this really everywhere. If you've watched The Real Housewives of any planet, you see a drunkorexia in motion. You see very thin, slender, put together women who are drinking excessively, avoiding the muffins or the bread basket. And that's sort of a cultural phenomenon we've seen. Is, it's a very sexy trend for the ladies who liquid lunch to have the rosé or the champagne, and we're not going to go very heavy on the carbs. And as though it's portrayed as sort of like this power lunch for women, it's actually very scary and very debilitating and very disempowering when you get to the heart of what it is. According to NEDA, which is the National Eating Disorder Association, 1 in 5 people that have an eating disorder also have alcohol use disorder. So that's like if you sat in a room with 5 people, and I keep saying women, but really I'm talking about humans. If you sat in a room with these people, all of which are in the throes of it, struggling with anorexia or bulimia or both, at least one of those people is also going to be struggling with their alcohol use. And so I'm not going to scare you through this talk with statistics on empty calories and booze and metabolic syndrome and the cardiac issues that come and the osteoporosis. You see how I'm kind of scaring you a little bit. But what I am going to do is just tell you my story, because I think that that is so much more powerful than going through statistics. But really, the main theme of my story is enveloped in drunkorexia. Next slide, please. So here you see images of me as a child. And when I got to my very lowest point with my struggle with what I call drunkorexia, it was a combination of heavy drinking and eating disorders. I remember having this conversation with my mom where I said, "Jeez, how did I get here?" Right? I am a smart, educated woman. I come from a good family. I mean, I know that there were some genetic precursors to these behaviors, but how did I get to such a low, low bottom? And my mom just sighed and said, "Well, you had some help along the way." And, in her motherly wisdom, I think she really knew big picture what that meant. But I had a hard time wrapping my head around what she meant about that. And I kind of just went about my sob story of, poor me, I'm in my rock bottom, I'm in active addiction. And I pushed that thought aside. And I'll share with you how it came back to me later as time went on. But what I did realize in the very beginning was that I wasn't born realizing or thinking that my cheeks were too chubby or my legs were too big, or that maybe my little tutu I'm wearing for ballet is too tight, my arms are too big. I didn't have those preconceived notions about my body as a young person. Most people aren't, right? We're born feeling happy and joyous, and we don't have that sense of knowledge of our body image at such a young age. I also wasn't born addicted to alcohol, right? This is something that I learned along the way. And so I knew that my life and my story was sort of a testament to how easy a person can end up here, and how insidious both of these phenomenons, disorders, diseases, whatever you want to call them, are. But this was sort of a thought that just kept rumbling in the back of my mind as I was trying to put this whole puzzle together, growing up and looking back on my issues. Let's go to the next slide, and you'll see here, gosh, I hate to see this from myself, but I really began restricting at a young age, because my earliest memory of knowing how my body compared to other people, of really being self-conscious of my body, was I was around 7 or 8 years old, and I was in all the sports there was. I mean, I could have put up pictures of me in soccer, gymnastics, running, I put up softball and basketball. I did every sport, volleyball, you name it. I was a swimmer. I loved sports. I was really athletic. And after a t-ball game, I think when I was about 7 or 8 years old, I went to a friend's house in my uniform, and she was on the team. And after the game, we wanted to go to pizza with her family. And I'm still in my t-ball uniform. And we thought, well, we need some clothes for me to change into. So my best friend, who was a very skinny blonde, just a real skinny, small child, naturally, she loaned me some clothes because we're kids. And her pants would not zip. She loaned me a pair of blue jeans, and I could not get them zipped. Her shirt she loaned me was this skin tight, like, it just kind of suctioned to my skin, and my little girl belly just kind of rolled over. And we had to lay me down on the bed to zip up the jeans. And we had seen our moms do this, wearing their very tight jeans. So we knew that was how you get tight jeans zipped. So by the time I stood up, I was in someone else's clothes, and I felt the most ashamed I've ever felt as a child. And I went to pizza with her and her family, hardly able to breathe, And I kept looking at her thinking, you fit in these clothes perfectly well. You wear them to school all the time. This is your t-shirt and here I am, I can barely even function. And I just remember feeling so ashamed at that point, that looking down at myself thinking, I must be big. I'm bigger. My body is bigger. And that kind of carried with me through pre-adolescence and middle school, and I began restricting. I, as a kid does, and pre-internet, looking at ways I could go on diets like they did in the magazines, reading any teen Vogue or any magazine I could get my hands on to figure out how to kind of restrict a little bit and change my body. Let's go to the next slide. So as I sort of grew up and kind of came into the high school years, I was very aware of my body in the sense that I knew it wasn't perfect. I wasn't considered thin, but I was very happy. I was happy to get on stage. You can see me here in a cheerleading uniform. I'm always happy to, be outspoken. I was very joyful, and I was sort of always an extroverted, kind of a comedian type character. And here I am in my cheerleading uniform. And then on the right in the red dress is my senior graduation photo. That was graduation day. And I just see myself with my hands over what I perceived to be my belly at the time. And I'm posing that way on purpose. Because around the time that I hit puberty, I wanted to be a fashion model. I had seen I lived through magazines, right? Because that was before social media and the internet was really out there. So I lived for magazines and fashion and clothes and jewelry. And I saw these models in these magazines and different shapes and bodies and sizes. And I loved the thought of getting dressed up and having my photo taken. So I convinced my mom to take me to a modeling agency, and the photographer took one look at me. We did some photos in a swimsuit, and he said, well, you more like have the body of a gymnast and less like the body of a model. And, as an adult, I can take that comment and think, well, gosh, I'd kill to have the body of a gymnast. They're in super good shape. But as a child and as a teen, I really wanted to be like what I saw in the magazines. I didn't want to be, my athletic, compact little self. And in high school, I had really big calves. They were, just a muscular part of my body. And my maiden name is McCarthy. So the kids, of course, called me Katie McCaffrey. So all these messages, were coming at me. And even later, years later, when I got married, my aunt came up to me at the wedding and said, well, I just can't wait to get a photo with this big buff bride. And I really, truly think she meant it in a nice way. But those messages I internalized as something is really wrong with my body. I am too athletic looking. I'm too, quote, buff. I have too big of calves. I'm too short. People kept commenting over and over on my athleticism. You must do every sport, when really I was, just there for the fun of all of it. And that's sort of how my preteens and my early 20s came about. Let's go to the next slide. And you have to think about too the time that I was growing up and the messages we received. My mom likes to say she grew up in the Mad Men era, where women were completely marginalized and silenced, and she was always on a diet. But I grew up in the heroin chic era, when in the 90s, when Kate Moss was the epitome of a model, and Naomi Campbell and Christy Turlington, and there was just this very thin aesthetic, coupled with the low-rise jeans and the way that clothing fit. And I just really, really wanted to fit this aesthetic as a as a woman. And, I didn't think modeling was part of my future because I'd been shot down by that photographer. So that was long gone. But I just wanted to see myself as this wafy, wispy. And I just kept going back to being too fat in grade school to wear my friends' clothes. And those were the messages that came to me through, me magazines and runway shows. And those were the messages that somewhat my mom was giving me because that's the way that she was raised. So let's go to the next slide. Unfortunately, as time progressed, I learned the game. And I realized that having an athletic body with exercise wasn't good enough. I wanted to be wafy thin. So I learned to starve. And I remember a friend specifically saying, well, you can eat or you can drink at lunch, like have some champagne, but you can't do both. Women don't do both. So I lived in a series of starve, binge, eat, binge eat, vomit, purge, repeat. And I lived on alcohol. My weight dropped considerably. I utilized booze in a sense that it kept my blood sugar elevated enough where I could keep functioning, which is a very clear sign of drunkorexia, but yet I wasn't putting on that many on much weight because I really wasn't taking in very many calories. It also gave me the disinhibition to eat, which would quickly turn into regret and binge eating disorder. And during this time, I was in a car accident and I couldn't exercise. So I really felt like this was the only way. No food, only booze. Let's go to the next slide. The late 20s for me were basically starving, drinking, binge eating, purging, repeating. Sure, I got more of the male gaze during this time because, I was out having drinks with the best of them and I was partying a lot. And I really felt like, this is the body I was supposed to have, even though I was super unhealthy. During this time, I experienced increase in blackouts. I was driving under intoxication. My heart raced all the time. I had all these other manifestations with my skin and my hair. I'm not going to go into all the morbid details of what it's like to struggle with anorexia. Many of you may already know, but this was kind of my new identity. And, I lived this way. Let's go to the next slide, please. So the kind of summation of all of it, I remember one time I was at my lowest weight. I was working at the local hospital. I was a nurse real early, in my 20s, and I collapsed at work. I was performing some wound care on a client or a patient, and as I'm standing over her on the bed, putting my hand on a wound area, applying pressure, I blacked out and fell to the ground. My blood sugar was so low and I had a vasovagal reaction and fell to the ground. And this poor old woman had to hit the call light and call for help. Poor her nurse. And here I am, my friends are all nurses. They come running in. I'm on the floor of her hospital room. And she points down to me and she said, that girl's passed out. And they had to drag me out of there. And it was time for friends and family to intervene. And they certainly knew that my weight had fallen too low, that I was too thin, quote, that I was going without food. I don't know as if they knew I was binge eating and vomiting, but they knew something was wrong. And they also very clearly knew I was drinking too much because there I was front and center at every event with a glass of wine in my hand. But the term drunkorexia didn't exist at that time. It wasn't in our common lexicon. So, to my friends and family credit, and even to my own, I really didn't know how to explain what I was dealing with because it was both parts disordered eating and alcoholism. And both of them had an equally strong grip on me. And so it was a really, really hard time for everyone as they saw me just drop to a weight that was unsustainable for a body with a frame like mine. Let's go to the next slide. So, here I am. I'm late 20s, early 30s. I'm a daily drinker. I'm out there partying everywhere. And these behaviors, they become apparent to people around you. I'll never forget, I went on a date with a guy that I was really interested in, and we went to Mexican food. And the first thing I did was order some drinks because I'm, not really planning on eating the food anyway. If I did, I was planning on purging. And he stopped the waiter from bringing the drinks to our table. And he said, no, you don't get a single drop of alcohol until I see you eat everything on your plate. And that's when I realized people were watching, people were onto me. And I thought, well, that's silly. But I ordered something or other and finished it, and then proceeded to have some alcohol and kind of tucked that experience away as sort of deep in my heart. But I knew I was on a downward spiral. I just didn't know how to see myself out of it. It was a very scary time. And I got to a place where the main focus was to finish the cycle. I stopped caring as much in the social circles, about dressing up and going out. I stopped caring about seeing and being seen and partying. And I stopped caring about the actual party itself or the social scene itself. I was so dysregulated and so hungry that by the time I got to the event, all I wanted to do was finish the cycle. And the cycle was, I was so hungry that I was going to start drinking, which was immediately going to raise my blood sugar and give me some energy and allow me to party. And then it was going to disinhibit me enough to eat whatever snacks or party favors were there. And then I was probably going to end up in a binge. And then I was going to purge. And then I was going to collapse. And that was like collapsing like a bag of bones on the floor at the end of the night. That was my MO at every party, at every event. It was like, but all I wanted to do was cut to the chase and just collapse. You see, I knew that cycle was coming, and I was so exhausted, and I felt so trapped by the cycle that as soon as it came time for the party, I just envisioned myself. I wanted it to be over. I wanted to collapse, and I wanted to be done. Let's go to the next slide. So, as my 30s progressed, this is an image of me that I am mortified to show you, and also happy to show you because I'm on the other side of it. But this is a bloated chipmunk cheeks, from the vomiting and the saliva and the acid backwashing in the cheeks and the salivary glands. It's a common occurrence among people with bulimia. And if you can't see the images, maybe you're just listening. My face is like twice the size. I got to a place where my face was huge and bloated all the time. And I was drinking so heavily all the time and vomiting all the time. Every part of my life was struggling because of the alcohol. I was, driving drunk. My career was in a huge downfall, and my relationships were severed left and right. I was, single. I had gone back to my maiden name after being a big buff bride at a wedding. It turns out I was alone. So I'm back to my maiden name, which you can see I can't even sign on the ID because my hands are shaking so bad. So this picture to me is a reminder, and it tells 1,000 stories of where this all leads, because the sick and the ironic part of all of this is that it started out as vanity. It started out as a way to stay thin and pretty. It started out as a way to fit in, as a way to avoid FOMO, just to be one of the it gals. And this is where it led me to a distorted version of myself that is unrecognizable and very shameful. But I think this picture is important. So let's go to the next slide. Just going to pause here and take a sip of water. As a couple years passed, I ended up in a psychiatric facility. I think this was around 2016. So I was detained, so involuntarily admitted for danger to self, danger to others, and also being gravely disabled. And by that meaning that I had fallen from my baseline of routine functioning so far that my family was afraid for my safety and my welfare because I just couldn't manage day-to-day life. At the time, I was also very suicidal. I had ongoing suicidal thoughts, and I experienced quite a bit of mania during this time, whereas I didn't sleep for days at a time. I wandered around, I said gibberish sentences. I couldn't quit drinking. And so instead of throwing me into a detox facility, they put me into a psychiatric facility because I had so many other psychiatric issues going on that were so evident to everyone around me. And I think first things first, my family was very afraid that I was going to do something to hurt myself. So it took me getting out of that facility and even some time later. I think this was around 2016. Like I said, I was admitted to a facility in Seattle, Washington. And so I got sober on February 10th of 2018. So a couple years later, that's my sobriety date. And I spent so much time focused on my sobriety, on my recovery. I went in headfirst into recovery, going to recovery meetings, recovery online meetings, listening to podcasts. I went to my local AA meetings and sat and listened to other speakers, made friends in my community with as many people in recovery as I could. I bought and read 1 million Quit Lit books. And, I became free of the alcohol. But I knew at the time that the messaging was to keep it simple, stay sober one day at a time, and to not try to fix every part of my life, to just focus on staying sober. And so I spent a lot of time getting and staying sober, but not a lot of time working on the eating disorder piece. It was such a huge mammoth task to put down the alcohol that I really focused on that, why I drank, how I drank, the people I drank with. I mean, I had so many areas to clean up when it came to my addiction to alcohol, and also so many amends and cleanup of my life to make that I sort of just let the eating disorder hide in the background. But during this time, I was still continuing to have binge and purge behaviors, starvation, restriction of calories, excessive exercise, and obsessing about food. So I felt like around this time, I was sober of alcohol, but not much else. Not much else. So somewhere, I think I had been sober for about 2 years, maybe 2.5 years. And I came across author Laura McCowan, who wrote We Are the Luckiest. I came across her and her talks and her social media, and I joined a sobriety group that she put together online. And part of her messaging just allowed me to have this massive shift in my perception of recovery. And she says, it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. And she's not the first person to say this, right? She didn't invent this term. This is probably been passed down for generations, but this was a very poignant term that she used in reference to recovery as a very important part of your journey. And this statement, I took this with every bit of myself and analyzed it and broke it down and regurgitated it and thought back and reflected. And I thought for the first time of taking my power back as my duty. It's my duty to do this. And, they say that recovery sort of begets more recovery, right? And I like to use like an analogy of a house. You might fix up one room of your house with new fixtures, new furnishings, new paint, furniture, and have it look super glamorous. And then the rest of your house is falling down. You have this one room, but as soon as you leave, you look around and you go, okay, now we got to fix up the rest of the house, right? Anyone who's done any kind of home improvement project can relate to that. And so it was time that I started looking at my whole self. And I felt this, it was so alluring to be free from my addiction to alcohol and the lying and the hiding and the deceptive ways and the double split life, the split personality, the double self, where I was a secret agent. It was so alluring and intoxicating, I guess I'll use that word, no pun intended, to be free, that I wanted that freedom for every other part of my life. And I remember writing on a sticky note on August 1st, 2020, that particular date, I stuck it on my mirror and I said, this is when I tackled the eating disorder, 8/1/20. It was like I set a new date for myself, like this is part 2 of my recovery. Next slide, please. So as things go, my mom was right all along. So frustrating. But when I heard this quote by Laura McCowan in her book, it reminded me of what my mom had said. You had some help along the way. She just said it in a different way. Like she really, really pressured me to get sober. So it definitely was my responsibility. But when she said you had some help along the way, I couldn't help but reflect back on those comments that I lived with, those body comments that I lived with for so long, telling me I had the body of a gymnast, my nickname being Katie McCaffrey because my calves were so big, being the big buff bride with the buff shoulders at my wedding, having a friend tell me that we'll just call it a liquid lunch. And that seemed to be a power statement. Recently, I went to a photo shoot and the photographer said, you look like you could bench press more than your husband. So yeah, you definitely had some help along the way. So you have the pressures to fit in. So you have media and social media now. And God, that brings a whole nother, opens a whole nother can. But, in my day, I had magazines and media, And I had comments from people and strangers. And I had a lot of comments from men. And I had my ingrained, my genetic personality defaults or faults or, my predisposition. So yeah, I had some help along the way, but it was my responsibility. Let's go to the next slide. Responsibility. Like, you can look this up in any dictionary, and I'm sure you all know what it means. But when I really thought about my responsibility to get help, to get sober, it really means I've been entrusted by the universe, by God, by all the powers that be, to do what I can that's in my control to help fix myself, heal myself. One of my favorite authors, Julia Cameron, she says, you pray to catch the bus and then you run as fast as you can. And I had applied that to all other areas of my life. I had tackled my education as a nurse, my career, my relationships. I had tackled them all as 110%. And I had tackled my addiction to alcohol 110%. So I knew I had it within me to do it. I knew that I was capable of recovery from my disordered eating because I had done it in so many areas before where I went in with 110%. When I personally take responsibility for something, I go all in, which might lend to some of my addictive behaviors. However, I knew that I could funnel that and channel that into dedication to get better, to get well. And that became my mission. Next slide, please. So the money slide, how do we recover, right? This is the tricky part. And if you Google, and I'm sure many of you have, disordered eating, the methods of recovery are vague, to say the least. They're very nuanced, and there's no bullet-pointed recovery cure. So it really is individualized. So I'm going to talk to you about what I did to kick these habits. And maybe kick isn't the right word. Maybe so much as change the habits, because it's always a work in progress. One of my favorite authors, Holly Whitaker, she likes to say, throw the kitchen sink at it. In other words, do everything and show up empty. Do everything you can. And she uses that as a, as sort of a discussion point when she talks about recovery from alcohol. So I used that when it came to disordered eating, because that's how I knew to go about it. And so I hit the books, and I hit the podcasts, and I hit social media. And believe it or not, social media was really helpful in areas where people were struggling. I found so many different people that had really excellent social media sites where they were open and out loud about their recovery. So the first step for me was realizing that I'm not alone in this, not at all. I started talking about it in my recovery meetings, my alcohol recovery meetings with other women, and bringing it up. And I wanted the freedom more than I wanted to stay in hiding as a person with an eating disorder, as an addict, as a person that had two lives. I wanted freedom from all the things. I didn't want anything to have a grip on me. And I wanted that enough to keep going. And as it turns out, really, because I had already gotten sober, I could tackle this just like I could sobriety from alcohol, because the underlying etiology or cause of eating disorders and of alcohol use disorder are really the same, really. They go back to mental health issues, underlying anxiety, depression, people pleasing, perfectionism, maybe some trauma, PTSD. They both, like, both of these disorders with alcohol and with eating, they all kind of are caused by the same myriad of mental health issues. And I knew I had to tackle these issues, I knew I had to tackle my anxiety. I had to get on some medication. I knew I had to tackle my people pleasing and my perfectionism. And gosh, how do you do that, right? How do you even start? One way that I started was getting really freaking honest and speaking up to the people around me, speaking up when it came time to address the issue and not hiding. I didn't want to hide from myself. I didn't want to hide from everyone around me, my family. So I started speaking up about it. And I think somewhere in there is learning to eat intuitively, but I don't want to go too much into that because I feel like a lot of times people throw out these ways to kick an eating disorder. Oh, you should just eat intuitively, or oh, you should just eat vegan, or you should just follow the keto, or join a gym. I mean, it's just another solution to a problem of hustle culture, and I don't want to use that as part of my recovery method, as advice I would give to you, but that's how I did it for me, because I knew that once I began trusting myself, I could listen to my body. And I knew my triggers were being very, very, very hungry, right? Hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. And I knew my other trigger was eating too much that might lead me into a binge. So I could intuitively at least stay within the right quantities of really safe foods that I could eat repeatedly, that helped me get from one day to the next day, to the next day, to the next. One of my favorite authors, Danielle Laporte, she has a quote in one of her books, and I've heard her say this on podcasts. She says, "You are not the wound, you are the healer." And what she means by that is, like, you have the power within you. Now, you can choose the narrative that you're broken, that you're too weak, that you're screwed up, that you're beyond repair, or you can choose to live in the solution that the universe has for you, that all the power is within you and that no one outside of you has power over you. And I just chose to heal myself. I chose to be my own healer. And when I use the word choose, that comes with a lot of boundaries and a lot of developing a sense of personal agency, because I didn't have that before. I was a people pleaser. I was a perfectionist. I wanted you to tell me I was worthy. So when I talk about boundaries, and this is something that's very, very, very important in my recovery, was I got radical with my boundaries, more so than I ever thought. I mean, I am the healer, and my boundaries look like this. You will not shame me on what I eat or don't eat. I'm going to speak up and explain that I really struggle with food, and that I struggle with eating too much or eating too little, or this is where I'm at in my journey, and I'm going to set this boundary firm. If I feel safe eating a salad with some protein on the side, I'm going to do it. And I don't care what you think, because it's about healing myself. It's about feeling safe in my body, that I'm not going to restrict and skip a meal, and I'm not going to order everything on the dang menu and purge it up. And I had to set those boundaries with family and with friends, with people around me. I had to go to my husband and have a very difficult conversation about the food we kept in our pantry and say, I got to be honest with you. I'm not really eating all this junk food just because I'm an easy, lucky, happy-go-lucky wife. I'm eating it because I'm binge eating it and I'm throwing it up. And that was a hard conversation to have. It was embarrassing and I was sweating. And I think he thought I was going to tell him that I, had another family other somewhere in the Caribbean. He was so nervous when I sat him down for the talk, but it was so important to me that I was that brutally honest about food. So when it comes to setting those boundaries, it was like, I'm going to do this because I'm saving my own life. And I know where disordered eating leads. And I know that people can die from this, from the metabolic and the cardiac issues and the osteoporosis. And I knew that a heart attack was possible if I didn't get this under control. Not to mention that it's somewhere in this journey, my teeth had rotted so bad that I had to have 4 teeth pulled and replaced with fake teeth, with caps. Thank God that I had a job and the money and the resources to do this. But I mean, it was like 40,000, fake teeth, because the enamel was eroded from the vomiting. And I just looked at myself and thought, I'm killing myself. And so every time I had a hard time setting that boundary or speaking up, I just remembered how serious this was. I'm the healer. I'm giving myself permission to be the healer. Thank you to all the people on the way who have taught me all the things, right? All the authors and speakers and healers and leaders, and for all the books and podcasts that taught me the way, because here I am. So, in terms of taking my power back, we're coming to the end here. With the resurgence of the Y2K trends, I started to see online that the term heroin chic was getting pushed back out into the media. And it was part of what kind of spurred me to write this talk, was because it brought all that back up again. And I took it as far as making a t-shirt that said F heroin chic. And the reason why we put a hashtag in front of it is because I wanted that to trend as the new narrative. And I want to recover out loud and rally against those old narratives that got me so sick in the first place. And so I also think this in my mind when I go to put on an outfit, that I don't look like Kate Moss. I look like Kate Vitela. Fuck heroin chic. This is the body that I have, and I'm grateful for it. I also, I started modeling recently as an adult because I wanted to take my own power back and say, I'm going to stand on a stage with the body I have. And I use a hashtag whenever I post a modeling photo, hashtag modeling for mental health, because what I'm really doing is recovering out loud. I'm taking a stand and saying, this is good enough. This is good enough. This is what recovery looks like. I am healthy. I'm a healthy weight, have all my teeth, and here I am. So we're getting toward the end of the hour, and I want to just kind of cap it off with a bit of a summary. And I put 4 letter R's on the screen because I think that that's a good way to summarize. If you're in this struggle, where you're at on the spectrum, I don't know. because drinking and eating habits are on spectrums of mild to
My friend is hosting a talk.
someone needs to mute themselves. Because drinking habits are on a spectrum, just like eating habits, of mild, moderate to severe. So number one, replace the rosé. And even if you are a person who doesn't have an alcohol problem, you will find that people still like to commune and join and have fun over a glass of fizzy water. And it won't trigger you to eat in ways that you don't feel safe. It won't trigger you to eat all the snacks and order things on the menu that you normally wouldn't. So replace the rosé, reclaim your body and your power. Take your body back. You have the right to show up for yourself. And respond with your determination. And what I mean by that is it's your responsibility, because nobody's going to fight to save your body like you are. You are going to fight the hardest, and you got one body. And so it is your responsibility. And I want you to respond with determination, because people oftentimes that struggle with disordered eating and substance use are very determined people. We're type A, we're perfectionists, we're high, we're highly capable people. So funnel that into a determination and a will to save yourself. And then the last one is recover out loud. And I say this because my version of recovering out loud is to speak, is to write, and to make a t-shirt that says "fuck heroin chic." But your version of recovering out loud can be as simple and easy and quiet as telling one person, or telling your journal, or starting the conversation with someone that you trust. It can be one person. And I promise you, getting those secrets out loud will take so much of their power away. And I have gained so many allies and power that are, the powerful in this journey, just by recovering out loud. So thank you so much for joining. There is a few minutes left if anyone has any questions. I really appreciate you coming and hanging out. You don't have to unmute yourself or raise your hand. I know it can be really scary. But ways to find me, you found me on Instagram at Kate Vitela. You can find me at the Sober Curator. That's the online magazine that Elise and I write for. She's the founder of the magazine, and we publish everything in that site from mocktails to fashion to wellness and wholeness journeys and recovery. So basically we go from fun to serious in that magazine. So you can find me at the Sober Curator at Kate Vitela. And if you don't have, you can't reach out to me now, you can always reach out to me later, and I would be happy to respond to your comments. Just to hear, that you're not alone is so helpful.
Can I say something? I just
Sure.
want to thank you, Kate. Honestly, you've touched my heart, and I've always loved you, but the way you shared your story, I just hope so many hear it, because it's so inspirational and it's so empowering for others to hear, because they will know they're not alone. So thank you for today.
Thank you so much, Kim. I appreciate it. I think unless anyone else wants to unmute and has any questions, we could probably wrap it up. Little modeling pictures for you folks. Just doing it. Thank you so much. Let's go ahead and end the meeting now.